Everyone, thank you for tuning back into an intelligent discussion. I'm Ben. You're here with Will and Justin. Today we're going to be discussing nation states. Will, you want to give us the definition?
Yes, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a nation state as a form of political organization under which a relatively homogeneous people inhabits a nation state, especially a state containing one as opposed to several nationalities.
So, as always, everybody, thank you for tuning back into an intelligent discussion. This topic could go a million different ways. So, following up on Will's definition, I just want to start it off by posing a question to the both of you. When we think about a nation state, we think about the development of a homogenous country with a set, not to be redundant, but a set of cultural views, militaristic views, economic views. People who, for lack of a better term, vie with each other, who have an idea of what they want out of a country and they identify with each other, so they create such a thing. We see this in a contemporary setting happening at the end of the 16th century, 17th century. What I would like to ask you two is, regardless of what historians say, regardless of what popular opinion is, what do you view as the first nation state? Something that you can identify and quantify as a country that truly is its own, one state, if you will, with one set of people that all identify with the same set of values.
Ancient Greece.
Okay.
I say that because you have a bunch of people who all, one way or another, identify as Hellenes or Hellenic. They have a democratically elected leadership, a modern army, and they're all in one spot in the Balkans.
Okay, so when we think about ancient Greece, we're talking almost about a collection of city-states that identify with each other simply because they are. I mean, if we look at Athens, that sounds like exactly what you're talking about, but would you consider Sparta part of that, or, any of these other cities?
In a way, yes. In the 3rd or 4th centuries BC, when you see the Spartan leagues dominate in Greece, and they may not be, it's a democratically elected monarchy because, Sparta had 2 kings. So I would say that Athens does qualify to be considered to be one of the, or not Athens, ancient Greece as a whole qualifies to be one of the first nation states to emerge in Europe.
I'm intrigued by what you're saying. Excuse me. I think it's interesting that the Greek as a unified identity really solidified itself when Persia attempted to conquer Greece. When all of a sudden, before that happened, if you were from Athens, you were from Athens, and if you were from Corinth, you were from Corinth, and if you're from Sparta, you're a Spartan. You don't consider Athenians equal to you. Obviously, you guys are in the same Greek area, but when Persia attempted to subdue Greece, there became this mentality of the Greek people being conquered or surviving, and that was basically the pitch that Athens and Sparta and Corinth kind of gave each other, was yo, it's not just you guys and us, it's now all of us versus all of them. Let's have a unification based on, in this case, our nationality, our nation state, which I think is interesting.
Do we see that carry through after the threat of the Persians? I don't want to say disappears, because they certainly don't disappear as we move forward and that empire evolves. But do we see a Greek, quote unquote, nation state or a Hellenic nation state? Do we see that kind of fall apart after the external threat disappears?
Yes. The Athenian League, which was created in response to the Persian threat. As soon as the Persians disappear from the Greek stage, they immediately resume fighting each other, and the league falls apart to infighting. So 100%. It didn't last very long, but it did have a brief occurrence on the stage.
I'm just curious. I don't know that this qualifies. When Macedonia, through Philip II and then Alexander the Great, subjugated, the Greek city-states and basically unified it and said, hey, this is mine now, and there was really nobody to lift a finger to say otherwise. that at that point was basically an empire, but it was an empire of unified people of one culture, like the Greek, the Hellenistic world. And then that, obviously exploded into what was Persia and Egypt and all the way, to India. And so obviously the nation state experienced rapid growth, but before he conquered Persia, essentially he had unified the Balkans. He pulled a hat trick.
Yes.
Got them all. Would that qualify, or would that not meet your definition?
I guess under a personal definition, no. For me, I'm saying, I don't know about y'all, but for me, no, because it's more of, a matter of subjugation. Like Philip unified them through force. And we see that much later on in history, sort of through force. I mean, if you want to talk about the French Revolution, or you want to talk about the unification of Prussia, obviously there's force involved. But I view Philip's unification almost separately, because it is straight up about conquering. Like, the Greek city-states were not part of his, state or empire, and he desired to make that so. So he did. It was not those city-states banding together and saying, like, we kind of get along, guys. Like, there's a lot we have in common. Maybe we can make something happen. It was Philip saying, like, it would be great if we all got along. And then
his army of Macedonians was like, wouldn't that be great?
Yes, exactly. They're all in the background.
Yeah. Okay. So coerced cohesion does not meet the nation state definition. And obviously, shortly after the fall and death of Alexander, that nation state imploded. And was very quickly carved up by political powers in every region.
It balkanized.
Yes. Balkanized is a great, before that term even makes sense. That makes sense.
100%. Moving our eyes back towards Europe, obviously most people point fingers at the French Revolution as being the catalyst for like France emerging as one of the first nation states. Personally, part of what makes a nation state in my mind and my definition is like that sense of unified, typically against something else, or unified to stand, apart from something else. And so I'm just thinking back to like, the very long standing fighting between France and Britain. Like, I'm imagining like English people and French people like standing, apart from one another, in between the English Channel, like flipping each other off, like, "Aha, you're French. We're, whatever." But like that's the mentality that came to me, is like, hey, like, all the tribes in England and in Scotland, like, basically are English, right? And they regardless of whether they right. And again, you can split hairs, but that's the unified front of how they basically were lumped. That's my kind of thinking.
What do you think the first nation state was, Justin?
If I'm going by a strict definition of simply the formation of what I perceive a modern nation state to be, I would have to throw it up between France and Britain. And I would almost probably have to go with Britain, or just, England in general. Being because before that sort of country or state takes shape, we have a melting pot of Anglicans, Saxons. At one point in the 1400s, we have the Dutch coming over. We have William Orange coming over to accept the throne in England. So we have multiple different parties coming to vie for English dominance. And then at the end of the 16th century, before the French Revolution, which is probably why I would lean towards Britain, is because we see this shared sense of, there's been quote unquote stability for a while. I mean, stability within the country itself, or as a, looking towards external threats, like there's stability. Obviously, internally, we have serious problems, but as a whole, I would see Britain because they identify as English. whether you are, from Wales, whether you're from England itself, that sort of thing. You start to identify as one, and then you put those values together and turn them outwards, which is why I would classify Britain as number one in my mind, because they band together to work towards common goals, whereas other countries, might be squabbling amongst themselves internally, if that makes sense.
It does. Now, would you say that the nation state is a permanent advancement that we have made on the political front, or is this just a temporary anomaly that will eventually succumb to something else?
I think, honestly, Will, that's an observation that I may not have the answer to. To answer it the best I can, I would say you can almost view the nation state as kids sitting at a lunch table together, and you're going to sit with the kids who look like you, talk like you, identify like you, and that's why they force you. I say force, but they encourage you to go out of your comfort zone and talk to people that are not just the spitting image of you. With the nation state, you get it's almost like a huge sounding board or just a box, where it's people who look the same, they talk the same, they have relatively same cultural values. They have goals for the country as a whole, or as the country's taking shape, they have an idea of what they want it to do, and they start to band together because that's the easiest way to accomplish those things. So in the modern era where we're at right now, it's almost like the nation state has drawn extremely distinct lines in the sand of like, we are British, we are American, like we have American values. This is what Americans want. And it makes it a little harder to cross that line and say, like, I get it. Like, you're not American, you're German or you're Chinese. Like, yeah, your country's a little different. It makes it harder to transcend that sense of nationality, if that makes sense.
I want to weigh in because what you said, vibrates like that's not the right word. It resonates with me. There we go. It's been a long day, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a day. When you were saying that, Justin, what really came to my mind initially, and I think I kind of want to weigh in on Will's question, is I think nation states kind of hit their ultimate end goal in the 20th century with the rise of, European powers clashing. And it wasn't necessarily like countries clashing. It was the state, the nation of Germany. It was no longer a German army fighting a English army or an American army or whatever. It was the German nation. The whole country mobilized during World War I. The whole country mobilized during World War II. Now, obviously, during World War II, factors were different. Situation was different. There was a leader cult that basically ran the country. And so obviously, and again, like obviously a king during World War I, Hitler during World War II, these nation states clashed. And I think since World War II, I think almost nation identity kind of almost took a back seat in a couple of ways. And it honestly might be for the better. And the example that I want to give is in America. America is comprised of 50 individual states that make up the country as a whole. And, America is an incredibly diverse place racially, culturally, linguistically, demographically,
Politically.
politically, and so it almost begs the question, is America a nation state? In the 20th century, I think the answer would have been a clear yes, especially during World War I, World War II, the Cold War, when it's the United States versus the USSR, like no longer are our petty squabbles as significant as this. Now that the country's, in turmoil over political events, elections, state different, people in California and people in Texas have very little in common. It's not a unification by much, that's my 2 cents.
Will, I don't know what your feelings are, but Ben, just to take that and ride with it, I wouldn't view the USSR as a nation state, I would view it more as a block, as akin to like the United States, where yes, there are 50 separate states, but the second that something, I think what makes the nation state distinct and what we can draw back to as they form, as we get through the 1800s, and tensions start to rise, less between people, less between kings, less between individual conflicts, and more about, it's very easy once the nation state is created for individual citizens to find drive and to get riled up at other citizens of other countries, even when they're not even involved. Like, in medieval conflict, you have feudal lords. Europe specifically, you'll come, you'll call your banners, you'll call your lords, they'll bring their knights, they'll bring their armies, and then you will march off to fight for whatever your king or lord or leader wants to fight for. In the terms of a country, you pit the entire populace in this nationalist struggle against another people who are very, they draw those lines and they say, like, these people are not us. We're Americans. They are not Americans. They are Germans or they are Russians. It gives the individual citizen this sense of like, yes, like I am American. I will fight, even if I'm not a soldier. I'm at home. I'm in a factory. I'm making automobiles. I'm helping people manage their finances, or I'm selling homes or whatever. Whatever you're doing, there's a spin to it while this conflict is occurring, where I'm doing this for my nation. And sure. That's kind of what I feel like one of the main drivers of nation state politics is it makes it really easy for you to point a finger and say, like, this guy's my enemy.
Well, and Will, I know you want to weigh in. I just want to say really quickly, what you're saying reminds me immediately of Carthage versus Rome at that Third Punic War, where it truly was, basically an extinction level conflict of, hey, Carthage, and regardless of, how many different cultures were inside of Carthage as a city-state, Rome surrounded and besieged for 3 years a city. And, that siege ended with Rome, cruising through the streets with legions, murdering everyone and, taking slaves and destroying a people. But in that 3-year struggle, regardless of, your social status, regardless of your race, regardless of your whatever, everyone in Carthage realized it's us against them, and everything they did became an effort for the defense of Carthage.
Mm-hmm.
Women cut their hair to make catapult rope. Like nothing was spared. If you could swing a hammer, you were learning to be a blacksmith to make arrows. Like that was it. And it seems like this idea of a nation state almost evolved in a way to combat the rising power of these cultures that continuously get better weapons, continuously get better technology, better leadership, better understanding of, hey, if we cut off your water supply, you can't survive. Like now it's beyond just, hey, like, in the past war used to be, armies fighting armies with very little consequence on the populace. And now in the 20th century, you see like total war kind of reinvigorated. And it's a situation where now the German people are being the victims of bombing 24/7, the entire last 2 years of World War II. It was just such a unification.
Yeah, you're hitting on a lot, Ben. Well, we left you with a lot. What are your thoughts? What do you think about that?
Well, to go back to the beginning of your dialogue, the United States of America, in my opinion, is not a nation state. It is a super state. It is the next level above in terms of political organization, because like Ben mentioned, most people in Texas have a lot in common. Most people in California have a lot in common. Same thing with Vermont, Utah. Florida is Florida, but you get the point. But you have all of these different states that like the individual states, the people that make up those states like Texas and California, Florida, Minnesota, most people have a thing in common. So they themselves could technically qualify as their own nation state because they're run by a governor. They have their own military, the National Guard, whatever. Everybody pays taxes to the state, and then they also pay taxes to the nation. So you could make an argument that the United States is, in fact, a super state. And in terms to what Ben said about total war, it seems like a nation state is required in order for an entire country to mobilize. Because when you have kings and kingdoms and emperors and empires, what Ben said was correct. Armies would fight, they would wage these terrible wars, fight these awful battles, and people in a town 6 miles over would be like, we didn't know we were at war, because they weren't involved. And then once you get into the 20th century, even into the latter part of the 19th century a little bit, you start seeing the complete mobilization of townsfolk. Entire cities are mobilized and all of that. So the question that I have for you guys then is, if the United States can qualify as a super state, what else would qualify as a super state? And where does the boundary lie between nation state and super state? Like, would the USSR qualify?
A super state as?
So if a bunch of city states coalesce to form a nation state, then a bunch of nation states coalesce to form a super state. Like NATO. NATO is a super state. The USSR, the Warsaw Pact, was a super state.
So you're saying NATO?
NATO was weak.
I don't know. I'm not going to disagree with that. But I don't know if I would call NATO a super state, only because it doesn't operate with the authority that, say, like the United States does, because it's comprised of, and I guess, I'm straddling this line. If a super state is comprised of nation states, technically, by definition, NATO would fit the bill, because we have like the United States, France, Ukraine, Germany, I guess at this time when NATO's created, West Germany, but it wasn't operating under a sole political authority, and those people didn't identify out of anything other than the desire to not get steamrolled by the Russians or by the USSR, So I don't personally feel like the USSR would qualify, NATO would qualify. The argument for the United States is strong, though. I think that makes a lot of sense, because America is so individualistic, founded on exceptionalism. It's all about the individual, that it takes some serious political power to mobilize those people as one. I think leaving World War II, America was the first and only super state, super power that I guess I would say hyperpower. We've seen superpowers, but the serious hyperpower on a global scale. And we have not seen up until, China, I guess. I would say China. Potentially you could argue like the Russian Federation, but really not so much. Like you don't see that sort of political give, the power to mobilize an entire nation on a whim, dictate economic policy, dictate state policy, all that sort of thing, until China really starts to develop in the 2000s. And I don't think America is unique as a hyperpower. I think they were, because they were the first one we've ever seen. And so that's why it's scary when you think about another country attaining that level. I think it was just a matter of time. America came out top dog, back-to-back World War champs. Let's go. And the likes of which the world itself had never, ever seen before. And no other country. Europe was in shambles. Africa had been historically ravaged by Western powers. The Middle East, the same. And the East was in shambles after the war as well. So these
South
countries,
America was the only continent that
Right.
escaped the 20th century relatively unscathed.
And they were plagued by corruption and or external coups or meddling by international governments. And so the U.S. was the only power that had the ability to play that part on the world stage. What are your thoughts on that?
Ben?
Go ahead, Will.
I think you're right. The United States is exemplary, and it is unique in terms of like the power that it wielded on a global stage, especially as early as it did in its lifespan. I mean, America at this point isn't even 300 years old, which, by the way, we're all going to be alive for the tricentennial anniversary, which is going to be an amazing 4th of July party.
No,
but
fun fact, I don't want to interrupt, but the United States of America has the second oldest surviving government on the earth. Since
second
America
oldest,
was founded. Yeah.
Because it's never been overthrown.
Hold on. We're experiencing audio latency. What did you guys say?
Behind who?
Both of you. I didn't hear Jack.
No, I'm saying behind the second longest standing. I don't want to say democracy. We're the first longest standing democracy, if I'm correct, but second longest standing government behind who?
This is where Ben should have known this fact before he said this.
Well, while Ben's looking that up, I do have one question for you: Is do you think the true driver to formation of a nation state and survival of a nation state, and I don't want to pigeonhole the question, but do you think it could boil down to one thing? And if that was one thing, it's just external threat. Like it's one group of people who identify, who find something scary, and they band together to fight it.
Yes. When there is an external threat, we will always band together because, like you said, it becomes a situation of us versus them. We can see this in internal U.S. politics today. The United States is the global hegemon, undisputed, no way that's untrue. And Americans are, for lack of a better phrase, they're turning on each other. We can see this exemplified in the Kyle Rittenhouse case, where the political differences of the American people have been magnified. We haven't been this politically
this might
divided
be too spicy
since Vietnam.
for the podcast.
Yeah, well, you know what? We're going to find out.
We're here. It fits in nation state politics.
And just to remind everyone that this is an adult podcast, Will, I love how much you are sucking America's dick right now with that giant American flag behind you.
I have my fair share of criticisms. Don't worry, they'll come.
As there should be.
Thank God for freedom of speech, by the way. God bless the Bill of Rights. Thank God.
Here's the thing.
Better watch your social credit, my friend.
I know, that social clout, baby. I agree with what you were saying, though, that the American populace is incredibly divided, and that division serves purposes here at home and abroad. And, everyone has a vested interest in understanding and, to any capacity they can, controlling the U.S., mentality, like our U.S., our politics, everything. And that, that might be very conspiratorial, but, every country is impacted by decisions that America makes. Mm-hmm. And that's just the reality. If Spain changes their trading laws, it is nowhere near as consequential as if the U.S. imposes tariffs, and it's just a matter to say, like, all that power that was accumulated, throughout the 19th and the 20th and now the 21st century that America wields today, anything that we do is significant on the world stage. And so now, at a time where the nation is very divided and we're beginning to reassess our founding documents and to say, hey, like, what did they actually mean when they set this up? And to answer your question earlier, San Marino, the micronation state, has the oldest still functioning, basically same as when it was founded government.
Which
after
was
that, 415 years ago to this year.
Okay.
So,
okay. Good for them.
They just managed to hide and just stay out of everybody.
Right. Exactly.
San Marino.
But yeah, I mean, again, the rights that we are given in the United States are up for debate now, and it's such an interesting thing to question, hey, can we change the fundamental origin of what made us special and remain where we are now? We don't know. It's a social experiment. If we change our fundamental rights as American citizens, do we retain our place on the world stage? Do we descend into a lesser role? Do we elevate further? If somebody in the next 10 years started the autocratic United States and, led us under one leadership until he died, is it possible that America could be better? Or would it get much worse? We don't know.
That depends on your criteria for better or worse. Yeah. I mean, if somebody were to install an American monarchy,
it would never work as a monarchy. I don't mean to interrupt you. Monarchy, no.
Dictatorship,
autocracy, maybe.
Yes.
See, now, what is, if we're going to differentiate between a monarchy and a dictatorship, what's the difference? I mean, we look at dictatorships like the one in North Korea where there's lineage. You had grandfather, then you had father, and now you have the son who's in charge of running that place. How is that any different from the European monarchs of the 17th and 16th centuries? besides a scepter and a crown.
Well, and I don't know if that was directed specifically at Justin. I don't want to steal your thunder.
No,
But
please.
one of the interesting things about, the rule of basically descendancy is you are not guaranteed that your successor will be a suitable replacement. Okay. And, there's a bunch of people that have gone into much greater detail on this than I am qualified or really interested in doing. But, how many times in history, how many times in history has a great leader emerged? And then for the next 3 generations, their kingdom kind of either stalled or, receded. And Darius the Great, it's no knock on his kids who, achieved more than, almost anyone ever could have, but they were not their dad, right? Philip the Great, Philip II, and then his son Alexander the Great is one of those rare instances where, a guy came from nothing, reached the zenith of political, military, just all around power, and had he was the perfect example of like, hey, we have all of our ducks in a row, everything's great, and then hands it off to his son, although he got murdered. And now his son, takes it to the next level. That's not very common at the historical level, and how many other times through history has that happened? And I'd be surprised if there was another instance that went as well, because there's no guarantee that your kids will be as dedicated, as successful, as interested in what you're doing as you are. If you go from living a hard life to being on top of society, but your kid is born in a palace with marble floors and literal gold spoons that he didn't have to work for, and is that different? I think it is. That's why I think monarchy was a flawed system. It was an attempt to stabilize government, but you didn't always get the best results from it, personally.
Do you think
Thank you for
Alexander the
coming to TED
Great
Talk.
would have been able to accomplish as much as he did if he didn't have everything set up for him by his predecessor?
No.
I'm going to disagree. And the reason I disagree is Alexander the Great was not one to sit idly by and let the world go on without him. Now, I think that he was aided by the fact that, he was in that perfect situation. But I believe that even if Alexander the Great didn't have that army there, he would have been able to inspire and get to some level of success far beyond anything that reasonable people could imagine. I think he was a very fascinating and very unique individual. And, he died in his early 30s. Even if it took him 25 years to build a military close to what his dad's would have been able to, he still would have been in his prime as a man to go and achieve world
domination.
I think he was an exceptional individual, intellectually, strategically, physically. I mean, we only have certain elements and certain retellings of his feats, but a man who literally led his army from the front and inspired tens of thousands of men into battle and did not, mosey at the back or command from the back, literally was the first man over the wall at Tyre. Leaders don't exist like that, or they don't have the capacity to. It's not the same.
Justin, what do you think?
Sorry, again, monologuing over here.
No, you're okay. I mean, if we're talking specifically about Alexander the Great, I mean, without Philip II and what was left for Alexander, I suppose it's possible that he could have achieved what he did. I mean, there's so many what ifs, like if he didn't die in his early 30s, because he certainly would not have achieved what he did in this timeline in his early 30s if he had to do it without Philip. He would have had to not die in his early 30s and, be much older, because that time would have been spent consolidating power, inspiring his men, conquering the Greek city-states, that sort of thing. He wouldn't have been able to just kind of take all that and run with it. There would have been a lot more buildup. And I see you frowning.
Well, so I'm just curious now, what if Philip didn't get murdered and Philip conquered Persia? and Philip lived a long, full life, and Alexander the Great got that empire in his 40s or his 50s. And, maybe he's no longer leading from the front, but if he was able to solidify government and solidify infrastructure, what could, Alexander the Great have done with that empire?
The question boils down to would it all be the same? I mean, the whole point is if you're saying he's the first man over the wall at Tyre, he's leading his men from the front. He's taking the fight to the Persians head on. If he assumes this mantle at 40 or 50 and he's not either capable or not super keen on doing all those things because he's not necessarily willing to put his life in danger, he has a much larger empire fall into his lap at the death of Philip II. It just boils down to how that would shake out and what he would choose to do. I mean, if his men would follow him the same way, if he's simply just a strategic commander and, not one leading from the front, if he's able to capitalize on that,
Yeah, no, I mean, it's very interesting.
Well,
I think if Alexander the Great inherited a hypothetical empire that Philip II conquered, he would have spent his entire career just trying to keep it intact. He would have not had the resources to expand. I mean, Alexander the Great took his men to the limit with how far they conquered. And some of them started to get a little pissed off at the idea that they weren't going to see home again when they were busy fighting elephants in India. Like, mind you, he took the same army from Greece and conquered all the way to the Indus River. And once you're there, you have to go back the same way. And if Philip II was able to conquer an empire that size, I just don't think it would be possible for Alexander to keep his empire intact and expanded at the same time. Because especially if you take into consideration the succession issue, people would think, oh, the empire of Philip II would reasonably pass to his son. I can guarantee you there would have been at least one powerful individual that would have the resources to disagree with that physically.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think that's the whole point, right? You take your men on a conquest of the known world, almost the entire classical world, promising them spoils. You're going to go home to your wives. You're going to see your kids. They're going to be, 20 years older than when you left them, but you're coming home with untold riches. The second you hit another milestone and another milestone and another milestone, you're like, this is sweet. Like, I'm getting all these riches that I was promised. And whether it's Philip or Alexander or some other influential individual says, all right, guys, like, great job, great battle, next one. At a certain point, you're going to be like,
I got enough, bro.
I thought the whole point was to take this back home, and it doesn't really look like I'm going home. So, I think that's entirely accurate, Will. Like, at what point are these men just going to put down their arms and be like, look, like, I've had enough. I'm not sick of fighting or killing people, but I have a lot I have a lot to my name right now, and I'm really ready to consolidate that.
Enough is enough.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Ooh, interesting.
So I have a question for y'all, and I don't know I hope this makes sense. It's definitely not in the same direction that we were talking, but if I'm going to bring it back to nation states, Will, you mentioned the Kyle Rittenhouse case earlier, and we're talking about that's me mixing words, the current political landscape of America. Do you see sort of a similar scenario, or what are your personal opinions? What can you glean from, if you look at something like the Dreyfus case in France, where it causes huge political uproar within France for years, and people are split about how they feel. Is this man guilty? Is he not guilty? If he is guilty, I mean, what do we do with him? And you have a nation like Germany basically capitalizing on that, and almost stoking those fires from the outside as an external player, as a nation state where, they don't even have a stake in France itself. They're just wanting to gain more power. Do you see a modern nation state capitalizing on some of these political cases in the U.S. right now, almost, with all this division? Do you see them stoking that and using that to their own gain? Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense. And no, they wouldn't do that. And I can cite precedent on this. 9/11. Americans had never been more unified until they're attacked. And we've only been attacked like 2 major times have we been attacked on our own soil. December 7th, 1941 and September 11th, 2001. The Americans banded together right after 9/11 in a way that most people had never seen before in their lives. I mean, church attendance was through the roof after 9/11. And then it slowly stagnated down after that, which kind of gives evidence to the point that once it becomes a whole us and them dynamic again, we unify. And right now, America doesn't really have anybody to kind of target. So we're targeting the next greatest threats to our identity and our freedom and our power. And unfortunately, that's ourselves. It's North and South. It's the coasts and then the Midwest. It's the cities and the countryside, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. And I think anybody who's smart enough to run a government or a nation state will know that as soon as they start killing Americans or worse, then we're going to unify and we're going to become as one again. And then they're going to wake the sleeping giant and they'll ultimately regret what they did. So I don't think that they're going to capitalize on that because they know the risk and what's at stake.
Definitely. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Ben, thoughts on your end?
I'm stupid. I don't know. I think America, and I don't know that this is actually going to answer your question, but I think it's more in response to what Will touched on. America is in a very, very, very difficult spot right now because we are attempting to figure out what we as a nation stand for 20 years removed from our last unification. All right, and I agree with Will. But unification might not have been a good word for the aftermath of 9/11. That's what I meant by that. But essentially, you were exactly right. Like America had banded together again under that almost nation state mentality I was talking about earlier because they were responding to a foreign threat, something less tangible than a group of individuals. It was America versus this, right? And now, 20 years removed, that unification is gone because since then we've been, embroiled in multiple overseas conflicts. In the aftermath of that, seeing our citizens die overseas, come back, severely damaged physically, mentally, emotionally. Like we've seen all that, and not to mention civil unrest at home in cases as well known as the Kyle Rittenhouse, all the riots, the pandemic for the last 2 years. We're in this situation where we are attempting to find an identity, and the reality is appearing, at least personally, to be that America is diverse, and we have the freedom to be so. And that's something that is not the case elsewhere in the world. You didn't have those luxuries in Russia. You definitely don't have the luxury to, verbally disagree with your government in many countries around the world. Even in Canada, they're putting people in jail for things they say, So we're in a very special, unique, privileged environment. But I'm worried that we're focusing on small issues, personally.
So there's a lot to unpack there.
I'm going to stop you for a second. I've mastered the art of saying a lot, but absolutely nothing at the same time.
That's good. That makes for a good podcast conversation. I don't want to move on from that. I want you guys to keep that in mind, but I want to pose a larger question in the context of the podcast, and keep what Ben said in mind, but in the context of this question, do you think the formation of the nation state is a zero-sum game? And let me elaborate by that. What I mean is, do you think that regardless of when you think the first nation state came to be, who it is, what they're founded on, do you think now in the 21st century with over 270 countries, arguably, depending on who you are and what your views are, what country you're in, with all of these nation states that have defined values for themselves, Do you think that is conducive to growing as a race, as humans? Or is there always going to be a winner and is there always going to be a loser? Is it possible for us, as Americans, as Germans, as Chinese, as Indonesians, can we work together through diplomacy, trade blocks? Is it possible for all of us to get what we want because we all want different things because we're all defined nation states? Or is this not going to work in the long run?
The answer to your question is no. We are not going to be able to work together until we as humans face a foreign threat. We'll throw back to the episode that we recorded before this, the alien episode, where we're not going to be able to unify until there's an us-them dynamic that encompasses all of humanity and something else entirely. So because once the blank edges of the map were filled in and there is no more neutral territory, like everybody has a border with somebody. There is no frontier anymore. So in this day and age, yes, it's a zero-sum game. And because of the nature of that environment that nation states are operating in, there will always be a winner and there will always be a loser. Because if somebody wants a bigger slice of the pie, the only way they're going to get that is to take it from somebody else. And we can negotiate, we can talk, we can use diplomacy and all that. But sooner or later, there will be a disagreement, there will be an impasse, and war is just politics by extension. So I don't see any way that we could forego political violence or war in any sense. Not anytime soon.
I would definitely agree with a lot of that, for sure. Ben?
I find myself in an interesting position where I too agree with Will.
Nice. Unanimity.
Well, hey, one thing that I think is interesting and I think has implications beyond the obvious, but for the first time in human history, we are playing by different rules as far as sovereignty of nations, as far as like just human rights, as far as like just a moralistic sense of what's right and wrong. Throughout the massive majority of human history, if I was stronger than you, if my nation was stronger than yours, if you did something that upset me, I could just wage war against you, and that was okay. That was almost encouraged. Like the victor's might. Like the victor's might. You're right. Like you can do what you want. And it wasn't really, honestly, until the 20th century, like World War II, even, we were still fighting wars with this almost, but after this war's over, Britain is going to get this and this territory, and we're going to be able to achieve these. Like, this is only like 80 years ago. Like, this is not long ago that, it was okay to invade another nation because they had other resources, or it's okay to go into to go into Africa if you're Belgian and take over because these lesser people are not as advanced and we can use our guns and our technology. This is not long ago. This is within a century that all of this is happening. And now we're kind of playing by this game where, for more or less at the world level, borders are set. The United States is not going to get any bigger without stepping on the toes of another nation and pissing off the global community. It's no longer Germany versus France or France versus Britain anymore. It's now the global stage. We're playing under different rules as far as, hey, like if you're in Russia, you have a massive wealth of natural resources, right? But you can't cross those lines and go into Mongolia, or you can't cross those lines and go into the Ukraine. Somebody should remind Russia about that, but that's not going to that.
It's less of a question and more kind of building on that. It's going to be more of an open-ended statement. I want to hear what you guys have to say. But in the 21st century, might is no longer right. And arguably, from the 40s on, we've seen that. I mean, if you look at World War II, World War I as well, but World War II is a prime example. Germany takes Norway. They take Denmark. They take France. At a certain point, they take Italy. They take Romania. They take Bulgaria. And I'm not, it's not like in ancient times where like, oh, you pissed us off and like we're gonna, conquer you and you're part of our empire. I mean, sort of, but in this neo way of like, you're German now. Like you will never be what you are. Maybe you are, but if you are, like you're inferior. Might has been shown to not be right anymore. And like in the case of Russia and Ukraine, in a modern sense, Russia occupies Crimea, and Ukraine is crying out to the international community saying like, do you guys see this? Like, this is our country. These are our borders and they're violating this. We live in a day and age where, small countries, Brazil could invade French New Guinea in South America, and you're going to get diplomatic envoys from Latvia or Morocco saying like, what are you doing? Like, stop, like go back to your own country. It's no longer the days of where you can just cross borders and take things. It's like the idea of holding another country as your own and deleting that sense of that, that ethnicity, like that nation. Like if Brazil was to just be invaded by Peru and the Peruvians were like, look, Brazil is just part of Peru. Like we're just a big country now. I mean, it would just never fly, So, I mean, what are your guys' thoughts on that?
Might still makes right.
In certain circumstances, for sure.
It does. I'll go back to your Brazilian French New Guinea analogy. Why should we care if Brazil is intervening in French New Guinea politics? Why should we care if Brazil sends an army into French New Guinea, takes it over, decapitates their leadership, and installs a puppet regime? Why should the United States care about some tiny country falling victim to a country that is tiny to the United States on the on the edges of our map? If it has no effect whatsoever on like world stability, the American economy, why should we care?
So you're saying, will it ever go beyond feigning care? Because obviously other countries are going to say, stop, like what you're doing is wrong, And
yes, but that's all they're going to do is they're just going to say stop. They won't.
That's all anyone does.
They're not going to. Nobody's going to counter invade Brazil to avenge the population of French Guinea. I mean,
right.
That's
now. I don't want to interrupt. This is making me think of like almost America's current spot in Afghanistan. Like, collectively as a society, we've basically moved beyond and just said, oh, okay, well, that was less than well handled, but it's okay. Like, it's over now. It's behind us. But the reality is there are still tens of thousands of people whose lives are in imminent danger to death and great bodily harm because we goofed. The United States pulled out. We didn't have a good, and again, I don't want to get super political, but we as a society have collectively just been like, oh yeah, it was a mismanaged situation, but we did the best we could and that's behind us now. That doesn't give solace to the families of, these people their fathers are being murdered, their, wives are being raped. The thousands and thousands of people that helped the U.S. while we were there, and the literally thousands of U.S. citizens and other countries' citizens that were in these territories before this happened. There are still engineers, people that were working in rural areas. All of these people are trapped in this country and they have no way to get out. And it's one of these things where at the world stage, we're like, I can't believe the Taliban have these things set up outside the airport. And it's yeah, but what are you doing about it? And this is why I always joke about NATO. NATO's personally a joke. It's kind of this global society to be you shouldn't do that. That's so bad.
I would argue the UN is the same thing.
Exactly. And that was, these again, we're tolerating all these human right violations all over the world. And we're oh, we'll impose a trade sanction on you. That doesn't solve the issue, and it's one thing to say, oh, well, this requires drastic and immediate militaristic action in a large way. It's another thing to say, hey, how do we actually do that? And I actually wrote my college, history paper on this. It was about why the world needs an impartial third party, military that's equal in strength to any of the other great powers, because without that, nothing's ever going to actually be done, because to some extent, humans don't care. And all of this, faux sympathy, faux disbelief. I don't know. Personally, it's frustrating.
Will, I want to pose a question to you and hear from you. I want to follow up with a statement and pose the question. So, in the thinking about NATO, NATO is the prime example of nation state politics and how it's almost just petty politics, and how we talked about how there can be, not everyone can be a winner. I don't know if, I'm sure you guys are familiar, but the USSR asked to join NATO at, not at its formation, but after it was formed and other countries were joining, the USSR asked to join. And it basically put the West in this position where they were like, well, we can, let them in. And the very people that we are forming this treaty alliance against can now become part of it, or we can exclude them and keep it exclusive, and it can do what it wants to do. And for the USSR, it was a litmus test. They were saying, well, we will ask for acceptance. If they let us in, that's interesting. That's unprecedented. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. If they don't, it simply proves that the formation of NATO was specifically to combat Soviet growth, and that'll show us everything we need. So that boils down to just petty nation-state politics. And Ben, Will, the question I want to pose to you is, Ben says we need an impartial third party army, I guess, or militaristic force. When I think of that, I don't know if you guys are Game of Thrones fans, but in season 1, when Joffrey is ranting to Cersei about, well, the Northmen are our enemies, and if they're not listening to me, like, I'd simply crush them. And she says, well, with what army? Because he says, I want an army that's loyal to the king. They're going to do what I want. And she says, well, if the army is comprised of Northmen, what's going to stop the Northmen from simply going north and fighting for their own people? And he says, well, because I'm the king. And it's that disconnect of, if you have a third party impartial army, where do you draw these men and women from? Because if we're drawing them from nation states where they identify with their own people, their own cultures, their own values, what makes them fight for a higher, moral ground rather than just going home?
No, and so that was a big thing I wrestled with in this paper. It was, all right, here's a proposed solution to prevent, genocide and, human rights violations across the world, is to give, basically the UN a military capable of contending with any power on the planet. But then, hey, how do you make an army of people comprised of different nations be willing to, go against their own cultural values or their own people if the need arises? And that's a very daunting task, And so one of the solutions that I discussed in my paper was ensuring that, no portion of any part of this military was predominantly from one country, from one people, from one place. That way, in an attempt to diversify the group as a whole, you could combat allegiance to just one nation. And so, if you go ahead, Will, it sounded like you wanted to say something.
You touched on an important point of what defines a nation state, and that's a group of people who identify with something gestalt, something that, when all these people and all their resources come together, creates something greater than the sum of all its constituent parts.
Mm-hmm.
So if we want this third party impartial army to influence the world, it is possible. It is possible that you could take a bunch of Russians, a bunch of Peruvians, a bunch of Congolese, and a bunch of Americans and Canadians, and put them all together. And yes, they will have some allegiance to their home country. Like, Americans will always put America over Australia. It's just the way it works. So, but that's also what's got me thinking, is because that's the whole point of a nation state, is you have people from Chicago and Peoria and Bloomington, they all come together and they recognize and submit sovereignty to the state of Illinois. And
no, we don't. No, we don't.
In principle, at least.
The communist country of Chicago. Sorry.
Can't stand those fips, man.
I know, bro. You gotta watch out.
I think I got my point across.
I think so. I think Will makes a great point. Ben, thoughts on that?
I mean, again, I find myself in an interesting position. I'm trying not to agree with Will. Something about him being from Chicago and me being
Oh, I've
from
got plenty that you
rural
don't agree with me on.
Illinois.
Don't worry.
I know. No, I mean, it's a challenge, and it's something that we as human beings really do have to sit down and like decide. It's one, like, again, like in our second episode when we talked about nuclear weapons, is like, can human beings handle our weapons technology? And Will was like, the only way we'll ever know the answer to that is if the answer is no and we kill ourselves. If human beings can't not use nukes, we're all going to die. It's very evident. And so it's a similar situation where, why are we feigning this fake sympathy, this like faux regard for these problems, if in reality those aren't true? Again, only 100 years ago, Europe was applauding genocide at a massive scale all across Africa. Only 80 plus years ago, Jews were being rounded up and taken to concentration camps. People in circuses, people that were gypsies, and then just also war prisoners, like executed in the hundreds of thousands. Talking about like prisons in the Soviet Union and China, there's human rights violations everywhere. That's not to excuse things that the US has done. But why has society kind of said, oh, well, we're playing by different rules now? I don't believe that human beings have evolved. Personally, it seems unlikely.
We're the same that we always were. We just use different words and wear different clothes.
What do you think, Justin?
I think that I would agree with you both.
It doesn't matter. Have you seen that?
I think the only thing, I don't want to say the only thing, there's been a lot of positive human evolution, but a lot of that is overshadowed simply by the fact that a lot of human evolution is just coming up with better ways to kill each other, whether it's due to allegiance to a nation state or not. I mean, if you look at fertilizer, revolutionized like the growth of crops. We're growing more food, we're keeping our food alive and whatnot. We develop explosives out of that, or the key component. Like every positive innovation in human history has always had a dark side, or if that significant or if that specific innovation does not have a dark side, it led or is the predecessor or the precursor to something that was used to subjugate or kill or better one certain group of people or another.
The inventor of dynamite received a Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly.
That's
Alfred Nobel, is it not?
Let's find out.
I don't know. Call me Jon Snow, because I know nothing.
Yeah, Alfred Nobel.
Mm-hmm.
Look at that. Once again, I'm the stupidest guy on the podcast. I don't know. No, I mean, it's... Go ahead.
In order to keep this episode in line with the nation states, what is the best form of government for a nation state?
Historical precedent has shown, obviously I'm biased, we're all biased, I'm going to go off of what I know. Historical precedent, in my eyes, has shown that democracy is the best way to run a nation state. I'm not saying a democracy is the most ethical and or moral way to run a country. Certainly more so, you could argue, than a dictatorship or something. I mean, America, the way it is founded, is arguably more moral in a government sense than like a dictatorship in North Korea. I'm not saying that either are... It's not impossible for either to commit, crimes. What I am saying is, from a pragmatic standpoint, democracy is probably the most efficient form we've seen thus far, because people have been happy. They have had a say, or at least they felt like they've had a say. and it's provided us with a sense of relative stability. If I'm going not off of historical precedent and I'm just saying, what do I feel like the most efficient way to run a nation state is, I would honestly say some form of benevolent dictatorship. I mean, people are stupid and they're always going to bicker amongst each other. And if you leave it up to them, nothing will be accomplished. I mean, you see it in a democracy too. Like you vote and it's, unless there's some kind of serious polarizing issue, it's always neck and neck because we're going to group together. We're going to argue with each other. And if you were somehow able to rule with absolute power, yet keep people happy and provide them with the things they needed, I feel like that would be the most efficient form. Sorry, not trying to be controversial or anything. Definitely not advocating for some kind of dictatorship. Just saying from an efficiency standpoint, it probably makes the most sense.
So your definition of best is efficient.
Oh, shit. I guess from what I just said,
like that.
what I just said, yes, but it's definitely subjective. Best, if I'm going to redefine, I would say best is efficient with morality. I think you in order to achieve best, you have to combine the two, because you can be really efficient and be absolutely immoral, and you can be moral and get absolutely nothing done. So it has to be a combination.
100%.
Ben, what do you think? Best government for a nation state.
So in the context of nation state, I believe that the best form of government to both ethically and efficiently achieve results would have to be a limited oligarchy. All right, and I want to make sure I have my definition of oligarchy correct. So let's see. Hey, this is important. Oh yeah, okay. Yep, I was correct. A small group of people having control of a country, organization, or institution. Yeah. So basically, a very small group of individuals would make all of the decisions at the nation state level. Okay, whether that is war, whether that is what is right or wrong, whether that is taxes, the not so sexy side of government, it would be much more efficient, which I believe is what Justin was talking about with like an autocratic leadership. Like, if one guy or one woman can say, all right, this is exactly what we're going to do, and we're going to do it right now, and just kill anybody that says no, that shit's getting done, and it's getting done like fast, Now, the issue is you get people like Hitler that do that, and you're like, oh, this is not good at all, And then if you go ahead.
How would your oligarchs be put into power? Would they be elected? Yeah. Would they be nominated?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think that's a super important point, because if you look at Russia and you look at like the Russian Duma and how a lot of that political body is dominated by just wealthy oligarchs, what is stopping the oligarchs from not representing the people the way that they need to?
So here's what I would propose, and I'm going to use, let's just for giggles say the country of Britain wanted to become a true nation state and implant this oligarchy.
Are they not a true nation state already?
We'll come back to that. If it was me and I was going to structure it, what I would basically do is I would quantify by, the number of people in Britain, select a group that I want the oligarchy to be. And in this case, again, I haven't done this research, but I would basically say, okay, I want 10 people to be this oligarchy. And what I would do is I would make sure that at least 5 of them at least 5 of them come from areas that are not the same as the other 5. And so whether that's someone from the northeast section, someone from this, the 4 cardinal directions, making sure that you are getting representation of areas that are not just controlled by wealth or politics. Because obviously if you go to a large city, or if you have a political headquarters like DC, you're going to get so much concentration of power in one area. The other thing that you would have to do is absolutely you would have to implement a rule where after you serve your period, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, a year, regardless, nobody related to you, nobody that you're friends with can become a member of this party for at least 10 years. All right. And that would essentially eliminate the ability of the extremely wealthy or the extremely influential from maintaining a grip on power for any period of time. And let's just go for, let's say 2 years. You're elected for 2 years. And then once you are at your end of term, no one that is related to you, no one that you are friends with may be eligible for the pool of the oligarchy for a decade.
So that's how you would combat tribalism.
Essentially. And again, obviously, like someone would be out there will be like, well, actually, here's a fun workaround for the system. Again, I came up with this on the fly. I think I came up with a decent way to structure a government. The goal is to allow a small enough group of people that can actually come to a consensus, even if they are of differing opinions, you know, and it's going to become a situation where regardless of political orientation, you know, you're going to win some, you're going to lose some. And that's something that's really lost on, I think, the American people, but also just like politics in general in today's day and age is like, you know, there are certain things that I'm not willing to sacrifice, but there's also things where I'm like, hey, like, just because personally I don't believe in this doesn't mean that it can't be done even for a short period of time. All right. And I don't want to use that because now people are probably going to be thinking like, oh, you know, some controversial topic. But I'm like, if you need to raise property taxes 0.5% in order to get out of debt as a country, you know, is that worth it? And then you can reduce it. Again, obviously government has this, you know, never-ending urge to continue to consolidate power, but I think there's instances where it can be used as a tool for good. What do you think, Will?
I think
I came up with a good theory.
The best one of what?
The best form of government for a nation state would be a philosopher king.
Ooh, they don't exist, bro. A king is not a merit-based position.
But that's the whole point of the philosopher king, was that it would be an absolutist monarch who was elected on merit and with emphasis on wisdom.
So it's a meritocracy kingdom.
An autocratic meritocracy.
So absolute power, but how do you decide who wins? Like, how do you decide who's merited?
An electorate would nominate a philosopher king based on merit, and then the electorate would be nominated based on votes from subdivisions in the nation state. So kind of like how we elect representatives in the House and Congress.
And I can't imagine that all those people voting for that electorate would have different opinions on what's right or wrong at all. I'm just casting doubt on your process here.
Well, way to do that after we didn't do that to you.
I know. Look at me being a dick.
This is my initial thought, like my very first thought. I don't mean to take this in a nerdy direction, but I just simply cannot help it when you say philosopher king. No. It immediately, I don't know if either of you are familiar with like Warhammer 40K or anything.
Yes.
But it immediately makes me think of like the God Emperor of humankind, where this guy is just like so perfect, so amazing. Like he knows the exact way to bring humanity together and like bring us to a golden age. Like they just put this dude in power. I guess he takes power, you know, in this case. And he's just, everyone just agrees. They're like, this guy rocks. This guy knows what's up. And they like, nobody argues it. They're just like, this is perfect. Like, we don't need governments. Like this is the man, you know, like that's what I think about when you say philosopher king, like someone who straight up has all the answers, you know, whether he's elected or not, or whether he just shows up and then they're like, you know what? This guy kind of knows what's up. And then you just let it ride because no one has anything to question.
You and I are going to have to talk more about 40K, especially since Gilman's the one running the show now. But the God Emperor of mankind in the Warhammer 40K universe is basically what I was going after. Somebody who is, you know, perfect in every way, where you just look at him and you just know he's the one. You know, for Ben, this would be, you know, Return to Jesus. Return of Jesus Christ.
Right. That's also what I'm thinking. Like Jesus shows up and everyone's like, "Yo, like it's Jesus." Like,
Yeah, we need Jesus in the Oval Office. That's what we need.
Well, so it's interesting when I'm apparently not as big of nerds as you guys, because I heard Philosopher King and I was like, oh, like Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. Yeah, somebody who didn't want it.
Oh yeah, totally,
but somebody who had the moral foundation and the merit to be there and the right. Obviously that's very important. I think that's part of like the Jesus comparison. Like, yeah, if Jesus came back, the human, the God Emperor,
it changes everything. It changes.
But like,
everything.
have we seen that? Is that possible?
Well, and so that's exactly what I was going to say. And I'm experiencing some audio latency. I don't want to talk over you. I think we
do not have any examples on hand.
I do.
Of Philosopher King.
Oh, really? You have an example? Who?
Yeah. Okay. So the closest that I think we've ever come to.
I do have an example.
Super.
I'll say that after Ben.
It's got to be George Washington, my man GW. All right, and here's what I'll say. All right, when the nation was founded as a democracy, there was a large proponent that wanted George Washington to become the King of America. Okay. Because he had gotten there through this this defense of the colonies against its former mother nation, but was seen not just as the wealthiest man in the country at the time, though he married into it, my man.
What a dog!
what you dog?
He also married into his slaves.
Well, we're gonna not go there.
Please pay no attention to this part of the history, folks.
Yeah. But you get to this point where, after he was the general of the Continental Army, and they were setting up final talks of like, all right, what is this going to look like? Like, we did this, we risked our lives. Literally, unanimously, this man was elected as president. Okay. And it was a situation where, in what other time in human history, under fair rules, under no threat of compliance, have we seen someone undebatably win an election at a large level? All right. And the reason I say that is he did not want the job. He literally did not offer himself for this position. He was asked to do it. And he literally, and I quote, said, "I will stand for office and I will serve." Like, that was his ethos. Like, he was there to serve. And after his first presidency, and I have a lot of respect, George Washington wanted to retire. And the entire electoral college, like everyone involved in the government, was like, "We need you again. Please come back. You are necessary to the government. Like, we need you." And he was like, "Okay, for 4 more years, I will be of service to the nation." And at that point, he literally, at the end of it, was like, "You know what? I'm so done with this. Like, I'm just going to go back to Virginia and die." Like, but it was a situation, again, like, I don't think we'll ever see it again, where, and maybe there was only 13 states or 13 colonies voting, but everyone voted so that the electing body of, electorate unanimously elected someone twice, 2 terms in the White House. Actually, the second election, he didn't get a unanimous vote, but it was close. It was still over 95 or something %. And so you have this situation where someone with extreme financial backing, someone with extreme political public recognition and public support, gets into the right position at the right time and leads America through its infancy into becoming what it is today. And I think that's the only historical example that really holds up. And again, I'm not saying George Washington was a perfect person or that he didn't mess up or make mistakes or have flaws, but I think in this situation, that's the closest that humanity's come to like a philosopher king. Like,
I have an example.
I'm interested to hear your example, Will. I wonder if we're going to say the same thing. Ben, I will say, I think George Washington is the only example I can think of in a democratic sense where he's elected.
The GOAT.
Will, who's your individual?
Marcus Aurelius.
Boo.
Ooh.
Marcus Aurelius may not have been a king. Nay, he was an emperor, a king of kings, and he was actually a philosopher. He wrote Meditations, which is widely circulated in philosophical circles still today. And I actually hand out copies to my friends every now and then. So
You sound
Marcus-
a little biased.
Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Yeah. Marcus Aurelius was the first example that I can think of who is authentically a philosopher king, although he was actually a philosopher emperor.
Okay, so
And he was one of the greatest emperors that Rome ever saw, up there with Trajan and Julius.
oh whoa, are you about to leave out Octavian?
Yeah, man, my
Octavian
man
too.
Octavian.
Yeah, they had a
Cool,
bunch. Why don't we just throw in Commodus and Caligula while we're at it?
A
So
little Nero.
I feel like the second I'm gonna say this, you guys are both gonna like absolutely hop on my back.
Bring it.
But I don't mean in a democratic sense whatsoever. Okay, I'm not saying he was chosen,
Oh God.
and
Let's hear it.
regardless of how he took power, I think in
Yeah.
terms of
Wait, don't say it yet.
yeah, Will, do you have an yeah? Go ahead, and write it if you can.
Oh, I don't have. Okay, I gotta type it down. Hang on.
Okay.
Put it in
Already-
the chat.
All right, here.
All right, yeah, I'll put it.
So I mean, in the sense that when he took power, arguably he had the backing of an entire nation, and they were just on board. Okay. Are we? Do we have our answers? No, not that. All right, folks, please let's see.
All right, okay,
Show
let's
the
hear it.
people.
Definitely wasn't thinking that.
Really, I'm saying, you know, he was not elected by any means. What do we think here? What do you have?
I had Stalin.
I guess Trump.
No. I think Napoleon only because, again, he is an emperor, a king of kings, but pretty much said he's like the Napoleonic, not to call, you know, just to describe the times, like the Napoleonic age, like DJT. Like he was the guy who was like France for France, like make France great again. And everybody was like, you know what? I think I kind of like that.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And like he had the full support of the military. Maybe not so much women, because he was definitely kind of slid back on the scale a little bit with women. But arguably, the general populace of France was like, we just went through a horrible revolution. This guy's kind of getting us on track. I don't know. What thoughts, opinions?
Did he was he a philosopher?
No, absolutely not.
Did he
This man
philosophize?
was not.
He did not philosophize. He did not falafel whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. I simply meant it in the sense that like he was someone that most people were.
He was basically a French rock star. You know, like I feel like Napoleon in some cases would be like almost if like Dwayne Johnson became president, or like, you know, Trump, like just a public figure that they're like, you know what, actually.
Yeah, but like
I
if
think
The Rock charged the Oval Office like with an M16 in his arms,
He wouldn't
know,
make
like-
it very far.
No,
well, that's what I'm saying. Like, you know, Napoleon rolls up like with guns. You know, if The Rock rolled up armed and he was like, guys, like, let's make America great. Everyone was like, you know what, Dwayne, you got a fair point. Like,
260 million Instagram followers might be enough. Nah, I think we've missed a few historical examples. I do want to throw out a fun George Washington fact.
right.
When George Washington found out that he was going to be the commander of the Continental the Continental Army, he went home, informed his lovely, very wealthy wife that he was going to be going away for a while. And then he got in a carriage and he stopped at the local bookstore and picked up 2 books. One on how to organize and, you know, train an army, and the other one was about like troop formations, and he left to go lead an army. Which is the dictionary definition of doing the assignment the night before it's due.
did you know that George Washington was referred to by the Native Americans at the time as Cartacorius, which means burner of villages, because they were not happy with that man.
Yeah, he
Well,
was an
yeah.
officer in the British Army before he became president of the United
Yo,
States.
actually, not even uncontroversial opinion. George Washington is the reason the 7 Years' War happened. It's that dude's fault. Let it be known.
Really?
Like I said,
Really.
we're not gonna go to the dark side.
Right.
I think, you know,
This is about the
but-
nation state.
yeah, it's about the nation state. It's not about what happened before the nation state. But
Treaty of
historical
Westphalia for the win.
examples. I mean, are we missing anybody? Is there a pharaoh of Egypt?
Oh, I'm
that,
sure there are tons.
You know,
Sure.
was there, you know, like Darius the Great comes to mind. You want to talk about an emperor? How about the king of the universe?
But if we're talking about someone who can run the
Bro.
most effective way to run a nation state. I mean, I don't know. He's not running a nation state, I guess.
Was Persia not a nation state?
I would view it.
You come.
It was an empire.
Mm.
Because if Persia is a nation state, then by default, a kingdom must be a nation state.
Or like the Japanese Empire would be a nation state in that sense.
Here's the thing. I threw out Japan before this thing started, and y'all laughed at me. Here we are.
No.
It's there. It's here in the chat. So
It's true. It's facts.
on the
An
dot.
hour and a half ago. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I truly think humanity's still in this growing phase of saying, is nation state the end all be all of government, or is there something further? Will we eventually hit like coalescence as a species? We don't know. You know, we can see what's in science fiction, we can see what's in Game of Thrones, but I think, am I having feedback issues right now?
No, I don't think so. I have a feeling our good buddy in the middle of our screens is going to have a very strong opinion on this. But if this is like it sounds sort of like an ending argument. If this is the ending argument, if the nation state is the be all to end all, no. If we're going to throw it back one episode and talk about the aliens episode, I think the be all to end all is some kind of global conglomerate of like, you know, where it's just like the UEC, like the United Earth Country, like it's just
Coalition.
one.
United Nations of Earth or the
Right. Like
Commonwealth of
there is
Man.
just one, you know, like maybe we're all still countries, but we abide by one overarching power, I suppose.
So when I play Stellaris, personally, I play as that robot civ that like basically like takes care of all the countries.
The Earth custodianship.
Yeah, the Earth custodianship. Basically, these robots are like, listen, we're going to keep you guys fed. We're going to keep you guys entertained. We're also going to secure your Earth, your planet, and also your solar system and your galaxy and your universe from all foreign and domestic threats. And so basically, go live, be happy, be prosperous.
Sounds a little xenophobic.
But they're robots. But like, here's the thing: like, they're not like.
This is about the nation state.
Robophobic.
Robophobic. Well, okay, so they're xenophobic if you try to resist.
The nation state is not the end all be all in terms of political organization. It is currently, well, when the Treaty of Westphalia was ratified in, what was it, 1648 in Munich, it was the highest form of political organization. But now that we have things like the United Nations and things have come and gone, like the Warsaw Pact and NATO and the USSR and all that, super states are becoming prevalent. And we see them first emerge after the Second World War with the United Nations. Perhaps even the League of Nations was the very first super state. You know, the whole thing where World War I was terrible. We can't let it happen. Yeah, LOL sucked. But
So did the game. But that's
the super state is currently our highest form of political organization. And, you know, like we've been saying, once these aliens show up tomorrow or never, it's not going to be until we form a hyper state where it's just a single global political entity. But I just don't think that's possible right now in the current political environment. So we're going to have to settle for the nation state is the most popular. It is certainly the most stable, no matter what form of government is at the reins. But I think that's going to be that way for a long time. Long time.
I think that's hard to dispute, honestly. I think it's here to stay until it quite literally is destroyed. I mean, how could you possibly dismantle this idea of us having individual countries? And there's no way, unless there's some sort of existential threat or complete breakdown in society.
I would agree. It would take us being knocked back or ascending 500 years in like civilizational development for the nation state to become obsolete. Because if we find out we can't control our weapons technology and we blow everybody back to the Stone Age, nation state becomes kind of obsolete because we'll, if it's bad enough, we revert back to tribalism. But then if we also make the greatest discovery in the history of science, and we have leapfrogged forward 500 years, God knows what kind of political organization we're going to have in the 26th century.
We need some Prothean ruins on Mars to be discovered down here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a pretty good place to kind of end the idea of nation states. Useful tool while they last.
If anyone listening has a separate opinion about what they think the first functional nation state was based on a cultural or whatever basis, or they have the perfect fit for a philosopher king, please let us know.
If anybody has any more comments on the show or suggestions, please feel free to suggest them in the comments section, and beware the keyboard warriors.
100%. I think one thing we missed, bro. How do we not think about Egypt? Just like
in the context
you just tried to end the show, and now
honestly, I think the show's over. Like we're now hanging out.
See, now if you're gonna cut it here, you got to be like, and scene.
Yeah. That's fair.
Please end the video right there. Please, for me, as a favor to me, just do it.
All